At a grand and opulent wedding, the groom decided to humiliate the bride by smashing a piece of wedding cake into her face. He expected laughter, a light-hearted reaction. But what happened next left everyone in stunned silence. The Lancaster Manor stood as a monument to a fading legacy, nestled among the rolling hills on the outskirts of the city. White stone columns framed its entrance, towering over perfectly manicured gardens. Inside, beneath glittering chandeliers and the watchful gazes of long-departed ancestors immortalized in oil paintings, the wedding of the year was about to unfold. Serafina Hale stood in the center of the bridal suite, facing an ornate mirror that reflected more than just her outward beauty. The weight of her gown felt heavier than it should, an unspoken truth pressing down on her. The dress was magnificent. Ivory satin, a fitted bodice, delicate beadwork that shimmered under the soft glow of the room. It was a gown meant for a fairy tale. But Serafina had long since stopped believing in fairy tales. She had spent years in boardrooms, negotiating multi-million-dollar deals, navigating a world where power was currency. She wasn't the type to be swept away by illusions. Yet as she gazed at her reflection, she couldn't ignore the unease coiling in the pit of her stomach. It had been there for months now, a whisper of doubt she had chosen to ignore. This wasn't a marriage built on love. Her fiancé, Victor Lancaster, was everything high society deemed desirable: tall, refined, impeccably educated. And most importantly, he came from a family that had once wielded immense wealth and influence. But that wealth was dwindling. The Lancasters, once a dynasty, had been quietly struggling for years, their fortunes stretched thin beneath the illusion of grandeur. The Hale family, on the other hand, represented the pinnacle of modern success. The Hale name had become synonymous with innovation, technology, and industry-shifting investments. Her parents, self-made billionaires, had built an empire from the ground up, commanding respect in every room they entered. For them, this marriage was a strategic move, an alliance between old-world prestige and new-age power. Her mother, Eleanor Hale, had framed it as an opportunity. "This is a merging of two legacies," she had said, her voice smooth and unwavering. Her father, Alistair Hale, ever the pragmatist, had assured her, "Love fades, but a solid partnership, that endures." And so Serafina had agreed. It wasn't that she had despised Victor, not at first. In the beginning she had even been intrigued by him, by the effortless charm he wielded, by the quiet confidence of a man who had never once questioned his place in the world. But as the months passed, the cracks in his mask began to show. There was something in the way he spoke about those unlike him, the way his words carried a subtle edge of condescension, the way he dismissed her work as a mere pastime, despite the fact that she was one of the youngest and most sought-after strategists in her field. The way he carried himself as though, by marrying her, he was bestowing her with an honor rather than securing his own survival. She had ignored those warning signs, reminding herself that marriages like theirs were common in their world, that love was not a prerequisite for success. But now, standing in this room, moments away from sealing her fate, she wondered if she had made a grave mistake. A knock at the door startled her. Her mother entered first, as regal as ever, wearing a gown that was only slightly less elaborate than Serafina's own. Eleanor Hale was a woman who commanded attention effortlessly. Behind her, Alistair Hale followed, his presence a quiet storm, his sharp eyes assessing his daughter with an unreadable expression. "You look perfect," Eleanor murmured, adjusting a stray curl near Serafina's temple. "Everything is going exactly as planned." Serafina forced a smile. "Of course." Her father stepped forward, resting a firm hand on her shoulder. "Are you ready?" It was a loaded question. She wasn't, but she nodded anyway. Minutes later, she descended the grand staircase, each step echoing against the polished marble floors. Every eye in the room turned to her, murmurs rippling through the sea of guests. Victor stood at the altar, his expression unreadable. He looked impeccable, of course, his suit tailored to perfection, his posture composed, every inch the polished heir to a crumbling empire. And yet, as she reached him, as his fingers brushed against hers, there was no warmth. The ceremony blurred past her. Vows exchanged, rings slipped onto fingers, a brief, practiced kiss devoid of passion. And just like that, it was done. Serafina Lancaster. The reception unfolded in the sprawling gardens of Lancaster Manor, beneath a canopy of twinkling lights. Champagne flowed freely. Laughter and conversation blended into the soft hum of an orchestra playing in the background. Serafina played her role flawlessly, smiling at the right moments, accepting congratulations with practiced grace. But beneath the surface she felt like an outsider in her own life, watching the spectacle from a distance. Victor, on the other hand, thrived. He moved through the crowd with ease, shaking hands, engaging in discussions about politics, finance, and the world's affairs. He made no effort to include her. Not that she expected him to. She wandered toward the edge of the garden, momentarily alone, when she overheard a conversation that made her stomach twist. "Smart move on his part," one man murmured, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "Tying himself to the Hale fortune. That girl's money will keep the Lancaster name relevant for another century." A soft chuckle from the other. "He played it well. She thinks she's getting a husband, but he's getting an investment." Serafina's fingers tightened around the stem of her champagne flute. She turned her gaze back toward Victor, watching as he laughed at something a guest had said, his hand resting just a little too easily on the shoulder of a woman from his past. And suddenly, everything was clear. She had always known, hadn't she? That this wasn't a marriage, it was a transaction. And she was the asset. For years, she had prided herself on being in control, on dictating the terms of her own life. But standing here, surrounded by people who saw her as nothing more than a financial stepping stone, she realized she had never been in control at all. Not yet. But that was about to change. The night shimmered with an effortless elegance, the gardens of Lancaster Manor glowing under the warm radiance of countless twinkling lights. Guests flitted between tables, glasses of champagne in hand, exchanging pleasantries and indulging in the spectacle of it all. To the outside world, it was perfection, a seamless blend of tradition, wealth, and status. Serafina Hale played her part flawlessly. She smiled in all the right places, nodded at compliments, and accepted well wishes with the grace she had spent years perfecting. But beneath the carefully maintained poise, she felt distant, as if she were watching the night unfold from the outside like a guest at her own wedding. Meanwhile, Victor Lancaster thrived. He was in his element, effortlessly weaving through conversations with the elite, discussing politics, finance, and the state of the world as if he had been born for it. He made no effort to acknowledge her. She hadn't expected him to. It was only when she stepped away from the crowd, seeking a moment's reprieve near the grand fountain, that she overheard a conversation that made her blood turn cold. Two older men stood a few feet away, whiskey swirling in their crystal glasses. They were business associates of the Lancaster family, men who spoke in calculated whispers. "Smart move on his part," one murmured. "Securing himself to the Hale empire like that? That girl's money could keep the Lancaster name afloat for another century." The other man chuckled. "He played it well. She thinks she's getting a husband, but he's getting an investment." Serafina felt her chest tighten. Slowly, she turned her gaze back toward Victor, who stood just beyond them, laughing at something one of his friends had said. His hand rested a little too familiarly on the shoulder of a woman she recognized, an old flame who had always lingered too close. Her fingers curled around the stem of her champagne flute. Perhaps she had known all along that this wasn't a marriage. It was a business deal, and she was the asset. The realization churned in her stomach, leaving an unfamiliar bitterness behind. She had always prided herself on being in control, on setting the terms of her own life. Yet, here she was, in the center of a wedding that should have belonged to her, surrounded by people who saw her as nothing more than a stepping stone. She had never been in control at all. Not yet. But that was about to change. From the outside, the reception remained perfect. Laughter blended with the soft hum of the orchestra, champagne glasses clinked in polite celebration, and the scent of expensive perfume lingered in the warm evening air. But Serafina no longer saw any of it the same way. She stood among the guests, her posture flawless, her expression unreadable, the perfect image of a woman who belonged in this world. And yet something inside her had shifted. She could still hear their voices, the men who had reduced her to an investment. She wasn't naive. She had grown up in a world where marriages were orchestrated for power rather than love, where alliances were dictated by wealth rather than affection. She had accepted that when she agreed to this engagement. But knowing something in theory and experiencing it firsthand were two entirely different things. Victor had not looked at her since the moment they stepped into the reception. He had not needed to. He was thriving, slipping in and out of conversations with the effortless grace of a man who had spent his life performing for the world. And that was what this was, a performance. "Smile, dear," a soft yet firm voice murmured beside her. Serafina turned slightly to see her mother, Eleanor Hale, standing at her side. She looked regal, dressed in a deep navy gown that shimmered under the lights. Her expression was composed, but her eyes held a silent command. "People are watching." Serafina forced the corners of her lips upward, though the motion felt foreign. Eleanor's gaze flicked toward Victor, who stood near the bar, engaged in animated conversation with a group of powerful men. "He's working the room well, that's good," she observed. "This is what we expected." That word again. Expected. Serafina exhaled slowly, forcing herself to remain composed. "You should mingle more," Eleanor continued, her voice carefully measured. "There are important people here tonight." Serafina's fingers tightened around her champagne glass. "Important to whom?" Her mother smiled, but it was cool, unwavering. "To you. To your future." A future that had been decided for her. She knew there was no point in arguing. Eleanor Hale had spent her life navigating rooms like these, understanding the intricate mechanics of power and influence better than anyone. To her, this was not merely a wedding reception, it was the first step in securing a lasting empire. And Serafina was the piece that had been played. Across the reception hall, Victor caught her eye. He raised his glass slightly in a silent toast, a performance for the onlookers. Automatically, she returned the gesture. But as the champagne touched her lips, her stomach twisted with the realization that this was all she could ever expect from him. A series of gestures, a partnership on paper, a cold, calculated arrangement designed to preserve an illusion. And yet the cracks in that illusion were already beginning to show. She saw it in the way Victor spoke to her father, Alistair Hale, how his politeness was careful, restrained, as if forced rather than genuine. She saw it in the way he interacted with her younger brother, Lucian Hale, who had always regarded him with quiet skepticism. Lucian had never trusted Victor. "You're an interesting man, Lancaster," Lucian said smoothly, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "Not the type I pictured my sister with." Victor's smile was tight. "And what type did you picture?" Lucian chuckled, taking a slow sip of his drink. "Someone who knows what he's getting into." Serafina recognized the warning beneath his words, and she recognized something else, too. The subtle way Victor's jaw tensed, the way his fingers curled just slightly at his sides. He didn't like being challenged, especially not by someone he considered beneath him. Serafina watched as he swallowed back whatever response he wanted to give, let out a calculated laugh, and excused himself from the conversation. She followed his movements as he walked away, watched as he downed half his drink in a single swallow before handing off the empty glass to a passing waiter. He was losing control. And for the first time that evening, Serafina felt something close to satisfaction. Victor Lancaster had played his hand well. He had positioned himself perfectly. He had secured himself to one of the most powerful families in the country. But what he hadn't anticipated, what he had failed to account for, was the possibility that the woman he had so carefully manipulated might not stay manipulated for long. He believed he had won, but Serafina had just decided something. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The air inside Lancaster Manor was thick with the scent of expensive cologne, aged whiskey, and the underlying tension between Serafina and Victor. The evening carried on with the polished elegance expected of an event of this scale. Soft music, carefully timed laughter, and the delicate clinking of crystal glasses as toasts were made in their honor. But beneath the surface, the illusion was starting to crack. Serafina had spent the last hour moving through the reception as expected, acknowledging guests, nodding at compliments, answering polite yet intrusive questions about their honeymoon plans and their exciting future as newlyweds. It was all mechanical now. The warmth she had once forced into her expressions had faded, leaving behind only the remnants of a performance she no longer wished to maintain. And Victor had not spoken to her since their obligatory entrance into the reception. She saw it now. The way his smile barely reached his eyes when he greeted her father, Alistair Hale. Their handshake had been firm but clipped, the exchange brief, almost distant. Serafina knew why. Victor had always been wary of Alistair, though he would never admit it aloud. Perhaps it was because Alistair was a self-made man, someone who had built his empire from the ground up, while Victor had simply inherited a name, one that was worth less and less with each passing year. Or perhaps it was because Alistair saw through him. "You've done well for yourself," Alistair said, his voice even, measured. "Your father would be proud." For the briefest moment something flickered across Victor's expression, something unreadable. And then, just as quickly, it was gone. He forced an easy smile. "That means a lot," he replied, but his tone carried no sincerity. Serafina watched the exchange carefully, noting the way Victor's jaw tightened just slightly before he turned away. She saw it again when he spoke to her younger brother, Lucian Hale. Lucian had never liked Victor. He had been polite, of course, because that was what was expected, but he had always regarded him with a quiet, restrained skepticism. "You're an interesting man, Lancaster," Lucian said smoothly, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "Not the type I pictured my sister with." Victor's smile was tight. "And what type did you picture?" Lucian chuckled, tilting his glass slightly. "Someone who knows what he's getting into." The tension was palpable. Serafina knew her brother well enough to recognize the warning in his words. And she knew Victor well enough to understand that he didn't appreciate being challenged, especially not by someone he considered beneath him. She watched as his fingers curled slightly at his side, the only visible sign of irritation, before he let out a short, calculated laugh and excused himself from the conversation. Serafina followed his movements as he walked away, as he downed half his drink in a single swallow before handing the empty glass to a passing waiter. He was losing control. She had always suspected his patience was thin, that beneath the polished charm was something volatile, something brittle. She had seen glimpses of it before, subtle moments when his frustration slipped through the cracks, when his voice sharpened, when his grip tightened. But tonight, the cracks were wider. And she knew it was only a matter of time before something broke. The evening dragged on, the spectacle continuing around her, but Serafina felt like she was walking through a dream she was desperate to wake from. Victor continued his performance, pretending to be the devoted husband, the perfect son-in-law, the charming heir to a crumbling legacy. But she saw through him now. She saw the way his lips curled downward when he thought no one was looking. The flicker of irritation when a guest mentioned her success rather than his. The way his movements became tighter, more restrained, as the night wore on, as if he were holding something back. And then, just when she thought she had seen enough, she heard it. She hadn't meant to listen. She had simply been passing by, weaving through the crowd, when Victor's voice carried through the air. "Smartest move I ever made." Her steps faltered. The words were spoken with just enough smugness to send a chill down her spine. The men around him chuckled. "You make it sound like a business deal," one of them joked. Victor shrugged, taking a slow sip of his drink. "That's what marriage is, isn't it?" Serafina stopped breathing. She turned her head just slightly, just enough to see him, to see the way he leaned against the bar, relaxed, self-assured, completely unaware that she was standing close enough to hear. The way he spoke about her as if she were nothing more than a calculated decision. Her stomach twisted. She had always known, hadn't she? Deep down, she had known. But hearing it like this, spoken so carelessly, so confidently, shattered whatever illusions she had tried to hold on to. She wasn't a partner to him. She was a means to an end. And in that moment, something inside her hardened. She was not a woman who let herself be used. And if Victor thought that this was his victory, if he truly believed he had won, he was about to learn just how wrong he was. Serafina had not spoken to Victor since their staged greeting at the entrance. Not once. She had watched him work the room, his expression perfectly composed, his voice carrying just the right balance of charm and intellect. But she had also seen something else. the slight downturn of his lips, the flicker of something unreadable in his gaze whenever her name was mentioned in conversation. And then, as the night wore on, she understood something fundamental about Victor Lancaster. He had never expected to share the spotlight. That realization became painfully clear as the evening progressed. Seated at the head table, surrounded by key members of both families, she listened as the conversation inevitably shifted toward finances. She had anticipated this. The Hale name had become synonymous with wealth. Not just any wealth, but new wealth. Wealth that had been built, not inherited. Her family had secured dominance in the technology and art worlds, constructing an empire from the ground up. The Lancasters, on the other hand, were a name that had once commanded power, but now clung desperately to the prestige of a past that was slipping through their fingers. Victor, in his mind, had made the smartest move possible. He had married into the future. But what he had not anticipated was that the Hale family did not give freely. "My wife and I were just discussing how beautifully this evening came together," one of Victor's uncles said, swirling his drink. His voice was smooth, laced with casual arrogance. "A grand affair. I imagine it cost a small fortune to orchestrate something of this scale." Serafina felt it before she saw it, the slight stiffening in Victor's shoulders, the shift in the air around him. She knew what he was waiting for. He was waiting for her father, Alistair Hale, to confirm what he had always assumed, that the Hale family had funded this spectacle, that this was yet another generous contribution from their seemingly bottomless resources. But Alistair Hale was not a man who catered to assumption. Taking a measured sip of his whiskey, he simply said, "We made sure the financial responsibilities were split fairly. This was, after all, a union of equals." His words landed like a hammer against glass. Serafina didn't need to look at Victor to know he was fuming. She could feel it radiating from him, the quiet fury beneath his carefully composed exterior. For months, he had been operating under the belief that marriage to her would grant him unrestricted access to the Hale wealth, that whatever financial struggles his family faced would be swiftly alleviated by his new position. This was not the first time she had sensed that entitlement in him. There had been small signs along the way, offhanded comments about how fortunate she was to be so well off, jokes that weren't really jokes about how lucky he was to have found a wife who would never have to worry about a thing. And then, more recently, the remarks about her work, how, with the kind of money she had, she didn't need to dedicate so much time to her career. He had assumed that as his wife, she would exist as an extension of his ambitions, that her wealth was simply an unspoken dowry, something to be merged seamlessly into his own assets. Now, with the reality sinking in that the Hale family did not hand out blank checks, even to their own, Victor was seething. He recovered quickly, of course, his lips curled into a well-practiced smile. "A partnership," he said smoothly. "That was always the intention." But Serafina heard it, the sharp edge beneath his words. He was furious. The rest of the table had moved on, but she remained hyper-aware of the man sitting beside her. The way his fingers drummed absently against the pristine white tablecloth. The way his jaw clenched and unclenched, as if trying to keep his emotions in check. For the first time that evening, Serafina felt something close to satisfaction. After dinner, the guests were encouraged to move freely through the estate, some gathering by the open bar, others venturing onto the grand balcony where a second orchestra played beneath the starlit sky. Serafina needed space. She made her way toward the gardens, inhaling deeply, the cool night air offering a moment of reprieve. She had barely stepped onto the stone pathway when she heard footsteps behind her. She didn't need to turn to know it was Victor. He fell into step beside her, silent for a few moments, his hands tucked into his pockets. And then, quietly, but with an unmistakable undertone of restrained anger, he said, "I didn't realize your family was so calculating." Serafina inhaled slowly, keeping her expression neutral. "Splitting costs fairly. A union of equals." Victor let out a short, humorless laugh. "That's an interesting way of putting it." She knew what he meant. He wasn't angry about the money itself. He was angry about what it symbolized. By refusing to bankroll the wedding entirely, her family had made a statement. They were not handing him the key to the vault. She turned her head slightly, meeting his gaze. And in that moment, she saw it, the flicker of uncertainty behind his carefully maintained facade. For the first time, Victor Lancaster was beginning to realize something. This was not the victory he had imagined. This was not the future he had expected. And Serafina was not the woman he thought she would be. This was not a marriage. This was a war. And the first battle had just been won. Serafina met Victor's gaze, and for the first time that night, the mask of effortless charm was gone. In its place, something colder. Victor Lancaster had spent his life believing he was superior to people like her. And yet, here he was, depending on her. She saw the humiliation in his eyes. And in that moment, she knew beyond a shadow of a doubt that this was not a partnership. This was a war. A quiet war, waged through sharp words and veiled threats, and the first battle had already been won. The rest of the evening passed in a blur. Victor returned to his performance, laughing with guests, positioning himself as the center of attention once again. But Serafina saw through it now. She saw the cracks. She saw the resentment simmering just beneath his skin. She should have felt uneasy, perhaps even afraid, but instead, she felt something else. Power. Because for the first time since this engagement had been arranged, she was the one with the upper hand. Victor had believed he was marrying into wealth, but he had underestimated her. And tonight, he had realized his mistake. The air inside Lancaster Manor was still thick with the weight of the evening's revelations. To the outside world, the carefully constructed illusion of the perfect wedding remained intact. But beneath the surface, tension simmered. Silent, invisible, but undeniable to those who knew where to look. Serafina moved through the reception hall with the same poised grace she had maintained throughout the night. She had spent years perfecting this ability. The art of appearing unshaken, of smiling even when she felt the ground shifting beneath her feet. But she wasn't just smiling anymore. She was watching Victor as he entertained guests, his movements practiced, his tones smooth. Watching the way his fingers tightened subtly around his champagne flute whenever certain topics arose. Conversations about business, about financial stability, about partnerships. He had not spoken to her directly since their encounter in the garden. She knew why. He was calculating, weighing his options, considering his next move. And Serafina? She was waiting. Because now, she understood him. Victor was a man who had been raised on the belief that he was superior, not because he had built anything himself, but because of the legacy he carried. But tonight, that legacy had been exposed for what it was. A facade. And she had seen the look in his eyes when he realized that she was not going to be his lifeline. That look was dangerous, because powerless men often sought ways to regain control. It was during the first dance of the evening that the shift became undeniable. The orchestra played a slow, sweeping melody as the floor cleared for the bride and groom. Victor took her hand, placing the other at the small of her back. Their movements were effortless, synchronized, perfect for the eyes that watched. But Serafina could feel it, the tension in his grip, the way his fingers pressed just a fraction too hard against her waist, as if reminding her of something. "You've been quiet," he murmured, his voice low, measured. "So have you," she replied, her tone light, unaffected. His lips curved into something that might have been a smile, but there was nothing warm about it. The dance continued. Each step was a silent conversation. She had once imagined what their wedding dance would feel like. She had thought that perhaps, if nothing else, there would be a moment, just one, where she could forget everything and believe, even for a fleeting second, that this was real. But there was no warmth in the way he held her. No tenderness in the way he guided her across the floor. Only calculation. Only resentment. When the dance ended, Serafina excused herself, needing space, needing to breathe. She made her way toward the grand staircase, away from the stifling weight of expectation, seeking a reprieve from the carefully curated perfection of the evening. And then, she heard them. Voices. Male voices, low and amused, carrying from just beyond the arched doorway leading to the cigar lounge, one of the many rooms reserved for the elite men of Victor's social circle. She might have kept walking, but then she heard her name. "Smartest move I ever made." Victor's voice, smooth and languid, threaded with just enough arrogance to send a chill through her veins. Laughter followed, deep, knowing chuckles from men who understood exactly what he meant. You say that like it was difficult, one of them teased. Come on, Lancaster, we all saw it. She's the prize of the century. Serafina's breath stilled. She's an investment, Victor corrected smoothly, swirling his drink. The kind that pays off in the long run. Another ripple of laughter. Serafina felt something inside her go quiet. Not anger, not even betrayal. Just cold, clear understanding. She had suspected, of course, had known in some unspoken way that this marriage had never been about love. But hearing him say it so plainly, so openly, without hesitation or shame, that was something else entirely, and it changed everything. Serafina could have walked away. She could have let him bask in his own self-importance, let him believe he had won whatever twisted game he was playing. But she didn't. Instead, she turned and walked straight through the arched doorway of the cigar lounge. The conversation halted instantly. Victor Lancaster, lounging in a high-backed leather chair, looked up, his smirk froze in place, his grip on his glass tightening as the air in the room shifted. The other men exchanged glances, uncertain whether to stay or leave. Serafina held his gaze, stepping further into the room, her expression unreadable. "Don't stop on my account," she said lightly. It sounded like a fascinating discussion. Victor's fingers curled around the armrest of his chair. A flicker of something crossed his face, annoyance perhaps, or irritation at being interrupted. "Serafina," he said smoothly, as if he could control the situation with nothing more than his voice. "Calling me an investment?" she finished for him, her voice calm, controlled. Silence. One of the men cleared his throat, shifting awkwardly. Serafina took another step closer. It was the first time since the ceremony that she had truly looked at him, really looked at him, and now she saw him for exactly what he was. A man who thought he had won. A man who had spent his life believing that his name alone made him untouchable. But she was Serafina Hale. She had built herself on more than just a name, and Victor Lancaster had just made a very, very serious mistake. The moment stretched. Then, without another word, she turned and walked away, letting the weight of her silence settle behind her. By the time she returned to the reception hall, the celebration was in full swing, guests laughing, drinking, dancing, completely oblivious to the fracture that had just split the evening in two. Serafina moved through the crowd, pausing only when she felt a familiar presence at her side. "Lucien, you good?" her brother asked, his voice quiet but knowing. She exhaled slowly. "I will be." Her eyes flickered across the room, landing exactly where she knew Victor would be. Surrounded, smiling, still playing his part, still pretending. He hadn't looked at her since she left the cigar lounge, and she knew why. For the first time in his life, Victor Lancaster had realized he was no longer the one in control. And Serafina? She was just getting started. The reception had reached its crescendo. Laughter grew louder, conversations more animated. The champagne flowed freely as the evening stretched into the late hours. But beneath the grand spectacle of wealth and tradition, Serafina felt something shifting. Something inevitable, like a storm gathering on the horizon. She had seen Victor unraveling, had felt the way his mask had begun to crack, ever since the moment her father made it clear that he would not be the financial lifeline he had counted on. She had watched his frustrations simmer beneath the surface, seen the way his grip had tightened during their dance, the way his words had sharpened when he spoke to her in the garden. And now, she could sense it. The moment when his carefully controlled resentment would finally spill over. She stood near the center of the ballroom, surrounded by guests who still believed in the illusion, waiting for the next grand moment of the evening. The wedding cake. A towering masterpiece of white and gold, wheeled onto the main stage, gleaming under the soft lighting. The cake cutting was a tradition, a symbolic gesture of unity. The first act, a couple performed together as husband and wife. Serafina had once imagined this moment differently. But then again, she had once imagined a great many things differently. She moved toward the cake as the guests turned their attention to the couple of the hour. Victor was already there, waiting, a practiced smile on his lips, but she saw through it now. He was still fuming from their last encounter, still stewing over the fact that she had humiliated him, first by denying him the financial access he had expected, and then by catching him in the act of openly demeaning her. He was a man who had always believed he was above consequence. But tonight, He had been reminded that even a Lancaster could fall. Serafina stepped beside him, careful not to let their bodies touch. The cameras were trained on them. Their every move documented, immortalized. A silver knife was placed in her hand. Victor reached for it as well, his fingers brushing against hers. The weight of the blade between them felt heavier than it should have. They cut through the first layer together. A clean, precise motion. Polite applause. Bright flashes of cameras. And then, the part everyone was waiting for. The tradition where the newlyweds fed each other the first bite. Serafina hesitated, only for a fraction of a second. Then, with careful precision, she lifted a small piece of cake onto her fork, balancing it delicately. Victor was watching her. Waiting. And she, too, was waiting, because she knew what was coming. She had seen it in his eyes all night. The anger, the resentment, the desperate need to take back control. And now, standing before the entire room, before the flashing cameras, before the watching eyes, Victor Lancaster was about to make his final, unforgivable mistake. And Serafina? She would let him. Serafina lifted the fork, carefully balancing the small piece of cake, and held it toward Victor. He met her gaze as he accepted it, his jaw tightening ever so slightly as he chewed. And then it was his turn. She knew what was coming before it even happened. She saw it in the way he took a much larger piece than necessary. Saw it in the way his grip on the cake tightened just slightly. And in that fleeting moment, she recognized it for what it was. His anger, his bruised ego, his desperate need to reclaim power in whatever small way he could. She saw it coming. But she didn't move, because some things needed to be seen. With a swift, deliberate motion, Victor Lancaster lifted the piece of cake and shoved it directly into her face. For a single frozen moment, time seemed to stop. A thick layer of sugary frosting smeared across her cheek, her lips, her eyelashes. The cream coated her skin, dripping onto the delicate lace of her gown. A few guests let out nervous laughs, unsure if this was part of the show. But Serafina Hale wasn't laughing. She didn't move, didn't speak. She simply stood there, letting the silence stretch, letting the weight of what he had just done settle into the air, thick and suffocating. Victor had expected laughter. He had expected people to brush it off, to treat it as a harmless joke. He had expected her to play along, to smile, to wipe the frosting from her face as if nothing had happened. But Serafina Hale was not a woman who tolerated being made a fool of. And tonight Victor Lancaster had finally overplayed his hand. The whispers began almost immediately. Soft, sharp, like the rustling of fabric in an otherwise silent room. Did that just happen? He threw that cake right in her face. That wasn't playful, that was... The sound of a glass being hastily set down punctuated the murmurs. Out of the corner of her eye she saw her father rise from his seat. Alistair Hale's expression was unreadable, but his presence was unmistakable. Beside him, her mother, Eleanor, pressed a hand to his arm, stopping him before he could take a step forward. Not yet. Not here. Serafina inhaled slowly. She reached for the napkin that had been left on the table beside her, wiping the frosting from her cheek in a slow, deliberate motion. Her fingers were steady. She met Victor's gaze, and for the first time that night, she saw something new in his eyes. Doubt. Uncertainty. A flicker of realization that maybe, just maybe, he had made the wrong move. She let the silence stretch just a moment longer, ensuring that everyone in the room felt it. Then, with quiet, devastating clarity, she turned on her heel and walked away. The reception did not recover. Not really. People tried to pretend, of course. The band resumed playing. The waitstaff continued serving. The guests attempted to shift their focus back to their drinks, their conversations, their carefully constructed illusions, but the energy had changed. The spell had broken. Serafina did not return to the ballroom. Instead, she climbed the grand staircase and retreated to the private bridal suite, peeling the soiled fabric of her gown away from her body, feeling the weight of the night pressing down on her. She stood in front of the mirror, staring at her own reflection. A woman covered in the remnants of what should have been a celebration. A woman who had, for a time, allowed herself to believe she could navigate this marriage on her own terms. She should have known better. There was no salvaging this. She had given Victor Lancaster every opportunity to prove that there was something in him worth trusting. And he had just proven, without a shadow of a doubt, that there was not. A knock at the door. She didn't need to ask who it was. Her mother entered first, followed closely by her father. Eleanor Hale's expression was unreadable, but Serafina could see the sharpness in her eyes, the kind of sharpness that only emerged when something truly unforgivable had occurred. Her father, Alistair, however, looked ready to tear through walls. "Darling," Eleanor said carefully, "you don't have to make any decisions tonight." But Serafina already had. She met her mother's gaze through the mirror. "This is over." And for the first time that evening she felt something close to relief. Because she had been waiting for a reason. And now, she had one. The final, undeniable confirmation that she would never, could never, spend her life with a man like Victor Lancaster. She had once believed she could bend the terms of this marriage to suit her, that she could outmaneuver him, control the pieces in a way that ensured her own power. But power meant nothing if she allowed herself to be degraded, and Serafina Hale did not belong to anyone. By the time the night was over, Victor would know that, and by the time the world woke up tomorrow, they would all know it too. To Victor, she had never been his equal. She had been his possession, something to be put in her place the moment she dared to challenge him. But not tonight. The room was still spinning with conversation as Serafina walked away, her heels clicking against the marble floor, each step deliberate, each movement an act of defiance. People whispered. Their voices were hushed but frantic, unsure whether to laugh off what had happened or to acknowledge the sheer audacity of it. Some guests had already started discreetly gathering their things, their expressions tense, understanding that they had just witnessed the unraveling of something far more significant than a wedding tradition gone wrong. Behind her, Victor Lancaster remained standing by the cake. His smirk faltered. The weight of the silence around him became unbearable. He had expected a reaction, had expected her to play along, to giggle, to wipe the frosting from her face with a playful shrug, to let the night continue as though nothing had happened. But Serafina Hale had done none of those things. She had not yelled, had not thrown the cake back at him, had not caused a scene. Instead, she had left, and in doing so she had let the silence speak for itself. She walked past waiters frozen in place, past guests who quickly averted their eyes, past members of her family who watched her with quiet, burning anger. Her parents, Eleanor and Alistair Hale, stood at a distance, their expressions unreadable, but their presence was unmistakably powerful. She could see the way her father's hands clenched into fists at his sides, the barely restrained fury rolling off of him in waves. If her mother had not placed a hand on his arm, Alistair Hale would have already been striding across the room to make Victor Lancaster regret every decision that had led him to this moment. It was Lucian, her brother, who moved first. He had been sitting at a nearby table, and the second Serafina turned away from Victor, he was on his feet. His jaw was tight, his expression unreadable, except for the fire in his eyes. She didn't say anything as she passed him, and he didn't ask if she was okay. He didn't need to. He already knew the answer. The grand staircase leading up to the bridal suite felt longer than it had earlier in the evening. She climbed each step with slow, measured grace, knowing full well that every eye in the room was still on her, that every guest was waiting to see what would happen next. They wanted drama, a spectacle, a confrontation that would turn this into something they could gossip about for years. But she would give them none of it. The doors to the suite closed behind her with a finality that felt like the turning of a page. The room was silent, untouched by the chaos below. The laughter and music from the reception hall were muffled, distant, belonging to a different world entirely. Serafina crossed the room with purpose, moving toward the vanity. A silver-framed mirror reflected her image back at her. The woman staring back was no longer a bride. She was something else entirely. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for the edge of the vanity, gripping it to steady herself. Not out of fear, not out of sadness, but out of the sheer force of what she was holding back, the weight of everything that had led her to this moment. The months of doubt, the quiet humiliations, the realization that she had let herself be talked into believing that this marriage was something she could control. She had been wrong. A knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. She didn't respond immediately. But the door opened anyway. Her mother entered first, moving with the same effortless poise she had always carried. Eleanor Hale's gown shimmered under the soft lighting. Her expression was composed, but her eyes held a quiet rage. Her father followed, closing the door behind him. His presence filled the room with unspoken fury. Neither of them spoke at first. It was Eleanor who broke the silence. "You don't have to go back down there." Serafina met her mother's gaze through the mirror, seeing not just concern, but something deeper. This was not just about the cake. This was about everything that had led up to this night. About the warnings she had chosen to ignore. About the choices she had made, believing she could handle a man like Victor Lancaster. Her father exhaled sharply, pacing to the side of the room, running a hand over his jaw, as though trying to contain his anger. Serafina had seen Alistair Hale furious before, but never like this. Never with a rage so quiet, so controlled, so dangerous. She turned to face them fully. "This is over." Her mother didn't flinch. Her father stopped pacing. Eleanor Hale inclined her head slightly, her eyes searching her daughter's face for hesitation, for doubt, for any sign that Serafina might waver. She found none. "Good," her father said, his voice like steel. "Because if you weren't walking away from this," Alistair said, his voice like steel, "I would have dragged you out myself." Serafina let out a slow breath, some of the tension in her shoulders easing. Her mother reached for her hands, squeezing them gently. "You don't have to make a statement tonight," Eleanor said carefully. "But tomorrow, when the world wakes up, they need to know exactly where you stand." And they would. There would be no carefully worded PR statement, no attempts to spin this into something salvageable. She would not be the woman who stayed. She would not be the wife who tolerated disrespect. She would be the woman who walked away. A sharp knock at the door, different this time. Urgent. Alistair opened it before Serafina could respond, revealing Lucian standing there, his expression dark. "He's coming up here." The room tensed. Eleanor let out a soft, tired sigh, as though she had expected this but had hoped for a little more time. Alistair's jaw locked. Serafina didn't need to ask who he meant. Of course Victor would come. Because this was what men like him did. They pushed boundaries. They tested limits. They demanded explanations when things didn't go their way. And tonight, Victor Lancaster was about to learn that Serafina was done giving him any. She straightened her shoulders, smoothing the fabric of her gown where the remnants of the cake still clung. Then, with the same effortless poise her mother had carried all her life, she turned toward the door. "Let him in." Lucian hesitated. Her father tensed. But Serafina had already made her decision. If Victor thought this night wasn't over yet, he was about to learn the hardest lesson of his life. Because this wasn't just about what had happened at the reception. This wasn't just about the cake. This was about power. And for the first time in his life, Victor Lancaster was about to understand what it felt like to lose it. The door opened before Victor even had the chance to knock. He hesitated for a fraction of a second before stepping inside the bridal suite. His polished shoes sank into the plush carpet. The room smelled of vanilla and orchids, a stark contrast to the heavy scent of whiskey and cigars that clung to him from the reception hall below. His gaze swept over the room, taking in the sight before him. Serafina standing in the center, her gown still stained with the remnants of the cake he had shoved into her face. Her expression was unreadable. Her mother, Eleanor, stood to her right, silent but imposing. Her father, Alistair, was positioned closer to the door, a physical barrier between Victor and the only exit. And then there was Lucian, leaning against the far wall, arms crossed, his stare a quiet warning. Victor had always been good at maintaining control of a room, but this was not his domain. He had come expecting anger, perhaps even tears, but instead, he was met with something far worse. Silence. He cleared his throat, forcing a smile onto his face. "I came to talk." Serafina didn't move, didn't even blink. She just stood there, her posture unnervingly steady. The silence between them stretched, thick and unbreakable. Victor had expected her to lash out, to confront him in front of her family, to give him something he could twist, something he could turn back on her. But she gave him nothing. His fingers curled into fists at his sides. "Are you really going to do this?" His voice was low, just a fraction above a whisper. But in the quiet of the room, it felt deafening. "Walk away from this marriage," Over a joke? Still nothing. His jaw tightened. His composure slipped. This is ridiculous, Serafina. It was just a bit of cake. I was playing along with tradition. Everyone laughed. No one laughed. Her voice was steady, cold. The first words she had spoken to him since she'd walked away downstairs, and they landed like a blade against his pride. His nostrils flared slightly, his frustration mounting. So that's it then? He exhaled sharply. You're going to humiliate me in front of everyone? Make a spectacle out of this? Over nothing? Her father shifted his stance, a silent warning. But Serafina didn't need protection. She had already won. She had won the moment she refused to engage, the moment she had stripped him of the reaction he had been counting on. Finally she moved, just a step closer, just enough to tilt her head slightly, as she regarded him with something that was almost pity. This was never going to work. Her voice was soft, unshaken, and the certainty in it made something inside him tighten, something he wasn't used to feeling. He had expected control, had expected to be the one dictating the terms, the one making the decisions. He had never expected to lose. And yet, here he was, standing in front of a woman who had already made up her mind. He let out a sharp exhale, his mask slipping for the briefest moment before he forced himself to smirk. So what now? You think you can just walk? The world doesn't work like that, Serafina. People don't just get to rewrite the rules when they don't like them. Victor's voice was tight, laced with the last remnants of his unraveling control. She smiled then, but it wasn't the kind of smile he had ever seen from her before. It wasn't warm, wasn't charming, wasn't meant to soothe or comfort. It was a smile of certainty, of quiet, unwavering power. I already have. And that was it. That was the end. Victor stood there for a moment longer, as if waiting for someone, anyone, to tell him this wasn't real, that she was bluffing, that this was just a momentary lapse in judgment. But no one did, because everyone in that room knew the truth. Serafina Hale was done. He turned on his heel and walked out without another word. The door clicked shut behind him. The silence swallowed the space he had occupied just moments before. Eleanor exhaled slowly, her eyes filled with something unreadable. Alistair nodded once, as if confirming what he had always known. Lucian smirked slightly, unsurprised that Victor had left without putting up more of a fight. And Serafina, she felt the tension drain from her shoulders. It was over. And for the first time in months, maybe even years, she felt free. The sound of the door closing behind Victor was final. Serafina stood in the center of the room, the weight of the night pressing down on her. But not in the way she had expected. She had imagined this moment before, long before she had ever walked down the aisle, before she had ever let herself be pulled into the illusion of control. She had pictured herself breaking away from him eventually. But she had not expected it to happen like this. Not so suddenly. Not so completely. And yet, as the silence stretched through the bridal suite, there was no doubt in her mind. Her mother was the first to move, stepping toward her with the same quiet grace she had carried her entire life. Eleanor Hale had never been one to raise her voice, never been one to act impulsively. She had been watching Serafina closely all night, waiting, knowing this moment would come. She reached out, brushing a loose strand of hair from her daughter's face. Her fingers briefly ghosted over the remnants of cake that still clung to her skin. "We'll take care of everything," Eleanor said, her voice smooth, assured. There was no hesitation in her words, no concern about what came next, because she had always known how this would end. She had seen it long before Serafina had been willing to admit it. Her father, Alistair, remained near the door, his hands still in his pockets, his expression unreadable. But Serafina knew him well enough to understand the depth of his fury. He had restrained himself tonight, had held back from doing what every instinct in him had told him to do. If Victor had been anyone else, if they had been anywhere else, there would have been no conversation, no confrontation behind closed doors. Alistair would have handled things in a way that left no room for discussion. But this wasn't about impulsivity. This was about something far greater than a moment of anger. Serafina took a slow breath, feeling the exhaustion creeping into her bones. "I want it done by morning," she said simply. Her mother's lips twitched slightly, the closest she ever came to showing amusement. "Of course." Lucian let out a soft laugh from where he leaned against the far wall. arms crossed over his chest. Victor's going to wake up tomorrow and find out his entire life fell apart while he was sleeping. Serafina met her brother's gaze. That's the least he deserves. She turned toward the mirror once more. Her reflection was fractured by the events of the evening. She had walked into this marriage believing she could play by the rules, believing she could shape the terms to fit her, that she could mold the situation into something she could control. But control had never been in her grasp, not in the way she had thought. Victor had believed he held the power, had believed she would be like so many other women before her, silent, compliant, willing to tolerate humiliation for the sake of appearances. He had thought he could diminish her, that he could push her into submission. He had never been more wrong. She stepped away from the mirror and turned to her father. Make the calls. Alistair nodded once. It's already being handled. And she knew what that meant. Her father had not been waiting for her to make a decision. He had already put things in motion. The moment she walked away from the cake table. The moment she had made it clear that this marriage would not continue. Eleanor had always been the face of their family, but Alistair had been the force behind it. By the time Victor even realized what was happening, it would be too late. Serafina moved toward the wardrobe in the far corner of the suite. She pulled open the doors. Inside hung the outfits she had brought for the honeymoon that would never happen. Designer pieces, a life she would never live. And for the first time, that thought didn't bother her. She reached for the first piece of clothing that felt like hers. Not the version of herself that had been dressed for society. Not the woman who had been groomed to be the perfect wife, but the woman she had been before. She let herself be convinced that marriage to Victor Lancaster would ever be anything other than what it was. A cage. And tonight, she had set herself free. The gown, carefully curated for a life she would never live, slipped from her shoulders, falling in a heap of ruined silk and lace. Without hesitation, Serafina reached for something else. Something simple. Something comfortable. Something that belonged to her, not to the illusion of the woman she had been expected to become. She dressed quickly, each movement precise, methodical. Her mother watched without comment, but Serafina could feel her approval radiating through the silence. When she was finished, she turned back to them. I want to be gone before he realizes. Her father checked his watch. We have an hour, maybe less. That was enough. She didn't need to see the aftermath. Didn't need to watch as Victor Lancaster realized that the world he had so carefully constructed for himself had collapsed overnight. By the time he opened his eyes in the morning, the news would already be circulating. The engagement was broken. The marriage was over before it had even begun. His business connections, the ones that had already begun to waver, would pull away completely. His name, once a symbol of status, would now be attached to the image of a man who had lost everything in a single night. There would be no recovery from this. Serafina had no doubt that Victor would try. He would fight, he would rage, he would attempt to regain control in whatever way he could. But it wouldn't matter, because he had underestimated her. And that was a mistake no one survived twice. She moved toward the door. Her mother and brother followed closely behind. Her father, already on the phone, spoke in a low, even tone, finalizing the details. Serafina didn't look back. She had nothing left to see. As they stepped into the elevator, Eleanor finally spoke. Where do you want to go? Serafina considered the question for only a moment, then exhaled. Anywhere but here, her mother nodded. Then that's where we'll go. The elevator doors closed, and as they descended, Serafina felt something she hadn't felt in a long, long time. Freedom.